As I previewed in week one, this course is going to focus on experimental research that has been conducted specifically on violent video games. So this lecture is intended to give you a basic overview of the definition of an experiment, what constitutes an experiment, and the remaining lectures this week will go deeper by providing you some specific examples of experiments. So the first question you might have kicking around your head is why focus on experiments this semester rather than other types of research that have been conducted on violent video games, given that lots of other types of methods have been used to study video games, such as surveys or focus groups or interview studies and so forth. Well, the reason we are focusing on experiments is because this social science research method is the best method that we can use to provide evidence of causality. So if we're going to make claims like playing this type of video game or that type of video game causes such and such thing to happen, we're going to want to use experiments to try and demonstrate that that's the case. And so when you see people making claims like violent video games make people more aggressive, what have you, those claims are typically and hopefully based on experimental research rather than other kinds of research that are less able to demonstrate causality, such as surveys or longitudinal surveys and that type of thing. And the reason I really want to do a deep dive on experiments this semester is because I want to demonstrate to you how difficult it is to really conduct a high quality experiment that is able to give us good evidence of causality, that is really convincing evidence that we should be using to sort of make decisions about our lives, make decisions about public policy, and so forth. And so as we move through this semester, I hope it becomes clearer and clearer how difficult and time-consuming it really is to conduct a high-quality experiment, but why it's so necessary to try and do so before we use research findings to guide our lives or to guide public policy. And rooted in sort of those realizations is this realization that all experiments have limitations, that no matter how well we conduct a particular study, that it's limited in what it can tell us about a particular phenomenon. In this case, it's limited in what it can tell us about the impact of video games on certain people. So kind of couched in these statements that we might make about, oh, we did this study, we did this experiment, and we found that playing this kind of video game caused this kind of thing to happen. Sort of implicit to that kind of statement is that it's under these specific circumstances under which we conducted this experiment, and we're not so certain that the same effect would sort of apply in other kinds of circumstances. And so it's really important when we're looking at experimental research to really dive into what those circumstances looked like so that we can understand the type of causal claims that are derived from that kind of study. So in the remainder of this video, I'm just going to quickly introduce two key terms to you that we'll be revisiting throughout the semester. The first is hypothesis, and the second is experiment. We're going to go over sort of the key features that make a study an experimental study. When it comes to hypothesis, what we're talking about is a prediction, and in the context of this class, we'll be talking about a prediction specifically about the impact of video games on individuals. So video game effects. What are the effects of playing video games on people? And you've probably heard hypothesis before, so I don't imagine that this is new terminology whatsoever, but I do want to sort of break down what constitutes a good, high-quality video game hypothesis for the purposes of our class. And so you could take this example hypothesis, playing violent video games increases aggressive behavior. This is a potential hypothesis that we could test through research and see if this is the case. And you can imagine just from how you hear people talk about violent video games in popular press coverage or in everyday conversation, this is a pretty typical hypothesis that people propose about video games. And it's one that we can test through experimental research. I've highlighted three components of this hypothesis here because it has three components that are key for constructing a hypothesis for the purpose of this class. The first is that it has an independent variable, or the cause. So this is the thing that we believe is leading to some changes in behavior. And so it's the independent variable because it sort of varies on its own. We can have more or less of it. And in the context of an experiment, we can actually sort of assign people to one level of that independent variable and compare them to people at a different level of that independent variable. So in this case, violent video games are going to be our independent variable. We could have people playing violent video games versus some other kind of video game. We could have people playing violent video games more versus less. The key feature here being that that variable can vary. It can sort of take on multiple values. Then on the other side of that, we have the dependent variable, the effect. It's the variable that is responding to changes in the independent variable. In other words, it's dependent on that independent variable. And so it's the outcome of whatever video games we might be looking at in the context of a particular study. So in this case, aggressive behavior, and this is a question we're going to be looking at throughout the semester, given our focus on violent video game research. And then also importantly, a high-quality hypothesis will propose directional language. So this is the prediction of what you think this relationship is going to look like. It's not just saying, I think violent video games are going to influence aggressive behavior. It's telling us specifically how we think it's going to influence aggressive behavior. In this case, suggesting that playing violent video games, the more that you do it, it's going to lead to more aggressive behavior on the other side, so increase. Other types of directional language would be decrease, increase versus decrease, sort of cause more versus less, depending on the context of the study, just making sure we have that direction, basically up or down. And then when we think about experiments also have three key components that we'll be focused on this semester. And these components are, first, we manipulate the independent variable. So in the context of an experiment, we're actually going to assign people to different levels of that independent variable. So again, as I mentioned before, the key thing about the independent variable is that it's able to vary. And so we are going to actually assign people to experience different levels of that independent variable. In other words, we're going to administer a treatment, as it'll sometimes be called. So this will be our sort of treatment group in a particular study. So if I wanted to know the impact of violent video games on aggressive behavior, I might administer some people to play violent video games. So I'm actually going to give them a violent video game to play. I'm then going to compare that group to another group of people who I consider as my baseline group, or a control group, is another kind of word that you'll hear thrown around. And so in this case, if my treatment group is assigned to play a violent video game, I might compare them to a baseline group who plays a non-violent video game, or sort of a similarly action-packed and exciting game, but that doesn't contain violence. And we'll sort of talk later in the semester about how we could try and design such an experiment in that way. And then finally, we're going to have random assignment to treatment or control. So in creating these different conditions, I'm also going to sort of assign individual people to either my treatment or my control group. So if my first participant comes into my study, they're going to be randomized into either the treatment or the control. And that just means that they have an equal chance of being in either condition, in either the treatment or control group, and that I'm personally not sort of deciding which one they go into. There's some aspect of randomness that goes into that, and we'll have a whole video coming up that sort of dives into the specifics of random assignment here. So again, taking this hypothesis, playing violent video games increases aggressive behavior. If I were to conduct an experiment to test this hypothesis, a very basic, straightforward experiment would be that I recruit some people to play a violent video game. Those would be my treatment group. I compare those individuals to people who play a non-violent video game, someone in my baseline group or control group. And those individuals who come and participate into my study are going to be randomly assigned to condition, which again, I will have another video that dives into random assignment more in depth. And then after they've played the video game, I might then assess how aggressive they are after the intervention. As I mentioned in the introductory lectures, there's all kinds of ways that we as researchers have tried to assess aggression. Some of these ways are kind of compelling, some of these ways are pretty silly. We'll see lots and lots of examples this semester of how researchers have attempted to measure aggressive behavior in the context of a laboratory study like this. For now, the key things you want to take away from this particular video are just the key components of a hypothesis and the key components of an experiment. And so for a hypothesis, the three key components we're going to think about is that it has an independent variable, it specifies a dependent variable, and it specifies directional language between those variables. And in the coming weeks, you're actually going to be assigned to pose your own hypothesis about video game effects, and that's a topic that you're going to then be researching for the remainder of the semester in the context of your experiment proposal. And when we're thinking about an experiment, also has three key features. It has a manipulation of the independent variable or administration of the treatment. It has a comparison to a baseline or a control, and it has random assignment. And when in the coming weeks, when you are actually asked to, well, much later in the semester, when you're asked to propose an experiment, you'll have to make sure that your experiment has all of these key features: assignment to a treatment group, assignment to a control group, and random assignment to those groups. So if you are walking away from this video and you at least understand you can at least remember these three components of a hypothesis and three components of an experiment, you're doing great so far. We're going to dive into some specific examples of these in the next few lecture videos.